So we're continuing our two-part episode with award-winning screenwriter Kirk Ellis, and we're talking about adapting from the page to the screen, and in particular, the award-winning John Adams miniseries. So, Kirk, when you're adapting, you're condensing in a way, and with John Adams, you're working not just within the framework of the biography by David McCullough, but the history books too, and the public perception of who this president was. So, how does that work? What do we need to know as aspiring writers? And
Well, so my job as a historical dramatist is different than that of a historian, be it a popular historian like David or an academic historian, who are bound to certain basic truths in a sequence of events that can't be moved. When you're doing drama, it's not so much about being true to the letter of the history as it is to the spirit of the time and the people. And that was one of the promises I made to David, that people would always behave as they would have in a certain situation, even though we might have to change the order of events slightly for dramatic purposes, or in extremely infrequent instances, put people in situations where they were not present in history itself. But you have to decide as a creator what your own red line is, what, where you will not go beyond. And that's something that you have to decide as an individual, and also about the history itself. You mentioned the history books and the ideas that people have of famous historical figures and people like John Adams. It's one of the things that's enjoyable about the process is to use people's expectations as part of what you are trying to unravel. Oh, you think this? Well, won't it blow your mind to know that? You know, are you shocked to discover that John Adams defended the British soldiers accused of the so-called Boston Massacre? Wow, people were totally amazed by that. Part of history, but not something they knew. Or his unbending approach to integrity in office, and to this belief that America is a nation of laws and not men, and staking his career, staking his reputation, sacrificing his family on these principles. I mean, all of that, if you're true to that, then whether or not Adams said this at the time in the film or the time in history, or whether he was in Boston instead of Braintree, those are not as commanding in importance as it is these fundamentals of character and time.
so Tom Hooper directed the entire series, and then he went on to direct The King's Speech, which won the Oscar for Best Picture. So I think this was part of, or maybe the beginning of the journey from television to HBO series to feature films for him.
So directors have it a little bit easier than writers and producers because they can afford to pick projects on which other people have labored for any number of years to get it to a point where a network or a streaming platform is saying, we're making it, you're starting January 2006 and you're on the air in March of 2008, that kind of thing, right? So to that sense, a director, that's why directors are always committed. You'll see their names attached to 3 or 4 projects at once. Well, they're going to go with the one that gets the money in the green light first. So I'd been aboard the project, as had Tom Hanks and HBO, for, I'm trying to think now, about 3.5 years before Elizabeth sort of made Tom's reputation at HBO, that 2-part miniseries with Helen Mirren and Jeremy Irons. Now, Tom had worked as a workhorse director for British television, doing EastEnders and a couple of Prime Suspects for the BBC and PBS. He'd done a couple of movies for British American television, but this was a big leap because it was a 2-year investment of time and energy on a very physically demanding production. So I can tell you how this happened. Adams was up for a while without major stars, which was the original idea. Hanks didn't want to have any sort of name actors who might bring some perception to the role. And we spent millions of dollars building sets out in Virginia. We hired a production designer, Gemma Jackson, who remained the production designer all the way through. Donna Zakowska, who was our costume designer all the way through. Both of them won Emmys for the show. Gemma went on to do Game of Thrones. Donna went on to do The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. So they've done really well for themselves. But at some point, they must have had a meeting in HBO. And the executive sat down and said, okay, hang on a second. This is going to cost us upwards of $80 million. They were right. It ultimately cost them about $100 million. And the only two people we can advertise in the show are Tom Hanks and David McCullough, and neither one of them is in it. Ooh, let's take a breather here for a second. Let's stop. And we had a director, we had 2 really good actors, all that stopped, and we were down for about 1.5 years, right? And then we're looking at 2006 going into 2007. And we knew that HBO knew there was going to be a Democratic primary. They thought, well, a good time to air the show would be during the Democratic primary season. By then, the candidates were sort of filtering themselves out, and it looked like it was Obama and Hillary, but there's still no director. So we're at the Emmys, and I've got a show up for the Emmys Into the West. I think it was up for 17 Emmys that year, as a matter of fact. Lost almost all of them to Elizabeth, as it turned out. And I'm at the HBO party. That's the party you went to, the HBO party. Regardless of who made your film, you went there. So I'm at the HBO party. Hanks is at the HBO party. Our producer's at the HBO party. And the executive in charge of the project at the time found us all and went, we've got your director. It's like, okay, that's news to us because we haven't had any meetings. And it was Tom Hooper. They made the offer to him that night at the party to direct John Adams. And he expressed his interest. And I met him in London. And then we embarked on this whole 2-year odyssey. And there were many disagreements. It was not always happy sailing, but the film benefited from everyone's input and everyone's particular talents. So what I will say about the script that I'm proudest of is the fact that over the course of the 7 episodes, you were looking at about 350 pages. I'm shot scenes in script, and only 6.
Hey, Kirk, are you getting a
Yep.
freeze, or is that just me?
I think that's you. Am I frozen, Jacques?
Oh, it's me. I need
you
a.
buzzed on that once you said, what I'm most proud of. And
So what I'm proudest of about the show and the script really is that over the course of those 7 episodes, we had about 350 pages of script. And we shot every scene in the script. Now, mind you, we made edits all the way through the production process, but of the scenes that we shot, only 6 of them were cut for the final air versions. So that was a pretty good record of scenes written to scenes shot. It was pretty tight by the time we got it before the camera. And one thing that happened was, both Tom and I guess the one thing we agreed on was that here was an opportunity to do things on a grand canvas. So there were battle scenes. There were scenes at Washington's camp. There were all scenes with Jefferson and Madison and Monticello. Even before we got onto the floor with episode 1, all those scenes fell by the wayside, and a decision was made creatively, and I'll give Tom some of the credit for this, that if the scene didn't have Adams or Abigail in it, it couldn't be in the film, because they were the fulcrum around which everything pivoted. So there's only one scene in the film that doesn't involve them directly, and that's Jefferson's death at Monticello at the end, because that was too historical a coincidence to miss. So those are the creative things that happened. That's why I'm one of the writers, and I guess maybe one of the uncommon ones, I don't know these days, certainly when I started, who enjoys the production process. I don't write in a vacuum of, well, I say if it never gets made, I'm cool with that. I write it to collaborate with people so we can make things better. That's what really turns me on. That's the process I love. And I love doing it on the day, on the set, with all these creative people. It's the best thing about it.
And Abigail Adams is played by Laura Linney in the story. But even though she is a major character in it, I'm guessing that there's so much about her that didn't make it into the film. Are there any anecdotes or bits of history about her that you'd like to let us know?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that's unusual about the show is that we meet them in early middle age. John's 40, Abigail's a little bit younger than him, but they're already an established married couple with 2 children at the time. So, and others on the way. But the whole story of their courtship is one of the great romantic anecdotes of American history. And it's not in the film. And it was never in the film in any version. But at one point, we had the 7 scripts as you know them from the show. And before we went into production, and this I think is even before Tom Hooper became involved, Colin Callender, the wonderful head of HBO Films at the time, who's gone on to other things, most recently Wolf Hall for the BBC, said, look, why don't we do a prequel about their meeting? Let's do that part of the show. Now, that would, of course, meant hiring, for one episode, younger actors to play them and everybody else who we might meet later. And I said to Colin at the time, you're never going to shoot. You're never going to shoot this. This is information the audience doesn't need. He goes, we're paying you for it. Write the script. So I did, and it was lovely. It was wonderful. It was this bucolic, sweet romance where John is courting another one of Abigail's sisters, but leaves a book behind, his copy of John Locke's essay on human understanding, and is shocked that Abigail knows the book when he goes to claim it, and makes a complete idiot of himself. And that's what starts their relationship. They have to wait 2 years to get married because her parents, who are fairly well-to-do, and her minister father and mother, don't believe that this guy's got a career as a lawyer, and they weren't necessarily wrong to believe that for a time. So all that was in there. And then, of course, HBO read the script, and Colin called me up or sent me an email saying, yep, we don't need it, but thanks for writing it. So those are the kind of things that yeah, sure, there's more to her story. There's a whole story to be made about what Abigail was doing in John's absence. We only touch on a fraction of that. But I think we get to the heart of that marriage and of those characters, because the show's called John Adams, but it's really John and Abigail Adams. It's the story of a marriage intertwined with this momentous portion of our early history where America's being born that was just irresistible dramatically.
And Thomas Jefferson and his friendship, maybe the same thing could be said there. You mentioned going through all those letters between the two of them. That must have been fascinating.
But you may remember an event that we did at the Cocteau where John Adams was being screened in a marathon over 2 days. And I had pre-taped a couple of interviews, and one of them was with Stephen Delane, the amazing actor who played John Adams. And Stephen on set was intellectual, demanding, constantly questioning things, to the point where you're like, Stephen, is there another question? Okay, let's shoot it. But we became very close over the making of the film. But I didn't know until I did that interview for the Cocktail Marathon. Stephen said, in answer to one of the questions I posed, he goes, well, you wrote Jefferson as a kind of revolutionary hippie. And I was like, yeah, kind of, that's right, I did. Because that's what he was. He was this proto hippie who had these wild ass ideas that were never really fully formed. If you go to Monticello, one of the first things you see is this clock in the entryway, the foyer, where he had people wait before going into the inner sanctum. And it's a like a ball clock like you used to have on a grandfather clock. And the ball goes right through the floor. He cut a hole in the floor of it because he misjudged how deep the thing was, the chain was. That's the kind of stuff. Jefferson was like a combination of the absent-minded professor and the great philosophical genius. And but that partnership in revolution that turned into a bitter rivalry and a real debate about where power lay in American government that we're still fighting today. Is it the executive branch or the legislative branch? We still haven't answered that question. They didn't then. And then that turns into this incredible correspondence and friendship. Jefferson and Adams never met after Adams left the White House. They never met again. But you would not be surprised to think they did because of the intimacy of the letters they exchanged. Still the greatest post-presidential correspondence in American history, and just a amazing writing, because Adams wrote he was voluble on print even more than he was in person. 3 letters for every one Jefferson wrote. Jefferson would say, "Hi, how are you doing?" And Adams would write 3 pages about everything that happened since the last letter. So it's great. But
well, and even on his deathbed, he says, "I've got to write a letter to Thomas Jefferson."
Yeah, I mean, his last words were Thomas Jefferson survives, when in fact Jefferson had predeceased him by several hours. But there was always that hope that one of that last generation for them would still be around.
So our co-host Gary Farmer is on the road. He's a very popular actor, and he's traveling back from Oklahoma. But I think if he were here, he'd want to ask you about John Adams' relationship with the Native American tribes, maybe in particular his support of the honoring the treaties in the South at one point.
Right. I'm not sure how much Congress Adams had with Native American tribes. It's important to point out that of all the founding fathers, Adams was the only one who didn't own slaves. Of all the signers of the Declaration, people forget that Ben Franklin actually had slaves in Philadelphia, but Adams had none. So he was untouched by that. So, I mean, Adams obviously living in Massachusetts, coming from this Puritan tradition where there had been a kind of eradication of the initial population in the generations before Adams was born. Yet he was very ecumenical in the sense that treaties had to be honored. He would be very pleased by the Supreme Court essentially deciding that Oklahoma is still Indian territory. I know Adams would love that one for sure. But when he wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, he came back from Europe to write that Constitution, and then went right back to France to help negotiate the peace treaty. In that, religious freedom is guaranteed for all races, creeds, and religions. So that was really, really insightful. And his Constitution became the model for all of the state constitutions that followed, including our own in New Mexico. So he was really, really forward thinking, but unlike Washington or Lafayette or even Jefferson, who did have direct contact with Native Americans, Adams was a little bit removed from that because of the nature of Massachusetts at the time.
So, I mean, these guys are driven. They're deeply driven by what they believe in. And they seem to understand the moment that they're in, but still from within that moment in history. So I'm guessing you at some point you've got to kind of put yourself in their shoes and imagine putting on your stockings and the shoe with the big buckle and tying your hair in or tying your ponytail with a bow, and then you go and argue with Alexander Hamilton, with all
Yeah,
your being.
yeah. Yeah, so David McCullough calls the process marinating your head. You literally ingest so much information that it's part of your everyday walking and talking and thinking. You don't, it's second nature to you to sort of live in that world. When you're doing any kind of history, whether it's John Adams or Judas and the Black Messiah or any of the recent, more contemporary historical dramas, it's not about you projecting your ideas about what's right and proper onto these people. It's about getting into their heads and walking in their shoes and adopting their attitudes and their postures, not all of which will be comfortable to you as a modern 21st century woke individual. Some of them you may find unpleasant or unseemly, but you can't back away from them. You have to acknowledge that as part of who these people are. And that's the part of the process that's both challenging and fun at the same time. And why it never gets tired, it never gets old. And if you do it well, look at what, my model for the show and my model for all historical drama has been since I was a kid and always will be I, Claudius. I watched that show at least once every couple of years. I watched it every episode pretty much back to back before sitting down to write even an outline of John Adams. And Jack Pullman, one of the great unsung writers of that BBC drama tradition, when they were doing everything on tape, sort of as though it were a stage play, but very cinematically, was unbelievable in the way he made Rome come alive. It was contemporary, but it never sounded hip or anachronistic, but it also never sounded arch and phony the way so much period.
But I, Claudius is, maybe 20 chapters.
It's really great.
This is, you've definitely got to say what you've got to say in a smaller format. But
right.
Yeah, I think if I, Claudius is the goal, you've certainly succeeded. And the drama in John Adams, I think, is superior. We haven't really mentioned Giamatti much, but I think that is, quite a transformation. Plus, you see him go through all these different phases of who Adams is throughout his life.
Well, we got mostly favorable reviews. I think our Metacritic score is like 78 for the series. I haven't checked lately, but we got two really bad ones. They were from the LA Times and the New York Times, and both for the same reason. Those two critics, for different reasons, thought Paul Giamatti was a monument of miscasting. Can you believe that? It just goes to show why critics can sometimes be completely irrelevant to the success of a show. Paul Giamatti totally incarnated Adams, totally incarnated him, to the point that when David McCullough saw Paul Giamatti, the real Paul Giamatti, in a corridor at the HBO office, he didn't recognize him, because Paul in life is kind of like his American Splendor character, sort of like this. And for Adams, he had the shoulders out, and he was always face forward and in your face. And so Paul totally incarnated that character. He knew everything about him, and so did Laura with Abigail. There was a point at which, when we're shooting in Hungary for the European sequences, in the last episode, I don't think they really needed us on the set. We could have placed the cameras. Somebody could have called action, and they could have done the scene and let us know when to come back or break for lunch, because they knew who they were playing. They were Abigail and John. There was no separation between actor and character. And what was great about working with them, and I've been lucky over my career, working with really great actors at the top of their game, like Ben Kingsley, Brenda Blethyn, Wes Studi. People who really know their craft, and they're about the work, not about the attitude. But with Paul and Laura, often the comment would be, can we do this without these lines? Can we play it without, this dialogue? So in talking about that 350-page script, yeah. But when we were shooting it in rehearsals, they'd cut a third of the dialogue out before we even shot it, and do it all with looks and gesture, the way really good film actors, as they've been from the silent era on, know how to do it. They taught me a lot about how to write, and I still try to apply those lessons.
You know, that's probably a good place to mention the scenes where they're the pillow talk scenes, I guess you could call them, where uh, Laura Linney and Giamatti are in bed. It happens in a few different episodes, but you get to kind of get this intimate peek into these conversations that are happening behind the scenes as
Right.
they're forming this nation.
Right, and where you can also see Abigail's influence on her husband, and notice that whenever she's not there, his decision making tends to be a little too arbitrary and a little too self-destructive. Right, from the beginning, that was part of the structure of the scripts, and it's going back a few years now, and I can't remember the exact trajectory, but I remember that Tom especially Tom Hooper wanted to have more of those, because that was a moment where we could get at what was eating at Adams or what was eating at Abigail, where that self-doubt came in. Because if you look at the scenes, they tend to be about Adams feeling out of his depth or having no allies. At one point he says, "I'm totally bereft." And Abigail's like, "I'm in bed with you, dude. Bereft? I'm right here. I'm right next to you. You know, tell me what you can't tell other people." That's when he's talking about how he really seems to have lost Jefferson as a friend and an ally. So there was a lot of that going on, and those were scripted. In the rehearsals, the actors would come up with, as they always do, with sort of slight alterations in rhythm and in wordage, or sometimes would have less to say than I put in the script. The reverse of that, I mean, famously, for those who were in the know on this at the time, the midpoint of the series is the middle of episode 4, where the Adamses and Jefferson go to see the Montgolfier balloon launch in central Paris. And that's the last moment where they will be in harmony. Now, in the script, that was a quarter of a page. And it just said, Abigail, John, and Jefferson watch the balloon in wonderment. That was it. That's all there was. So we're shooting this on a backlot in Hungary that's largely green screen, because I think in the background was a concentration camp set that we needed to obscure. Wouldn't have looked right for the period. And they're out there rehearsing it a long time. Tom's out there with Paul and Laura and Steve Delane. And we're like, wow, what's going on? And at some point, either I see him summoning me over with the finger, or an AD on a walkie comes to get me and says, "Look, we've been playing around with some stuff. Listen to this." And we were shooting the movie in sequence, so the actors had a chance to really get into these people's skins. So they play out a scene for me that is pretty much the scene in episode 4 of John Adams, where they're joking about, "I'll miss you, Mrs. Adams," and Jefferson has this pretentious statement about mankind now untethered. He goes, "Yeah," and Adams says, "Yeah, by a bunch of hot air." So all that came out of the actors' rehearsals. So I wrote everything down as they were riffing on it for me. Now, Laura especially had this amazingly long makeup and hair process to get on that French wig that was, 6 stories tall, and into the costume and into the corsets. So she had a 3-hour makeup due. And Paul's wasn't much shorter than that with all of his old age makeup at that point. So in the course of that break for me, I went into my tiny trailer, I think, which I shared with somebody else. I didn't have my own trailer on that set. And I punched up the scene, got it typed out. I had Tom Hooper read it and approved it, got it printed on whatever color of page we were using at the time. I think by then it was salmon pages, and handed it to Paul, Laura, and Stephen as they came out in costume and makeup to go onto the set to shoot the scene. They looked at it once, they did it in like 2 or 3 takes, and we were done. That's the kind of shoot that was at that point. But you have to have actors who are classically trained, like all of them were, to be able to get away with that. But that was a glorious day for me. I love that, and I still look at that scene in the movie and go, people think I sort of did that 3 years before. No, I did it like 3 minutes before it was shot, with all the actors contributing, and that's what you live for when you're shooting a film or a television show. really is. Greatest moment in my writing career.
Oh God, thank you for sharing it with us. We've I think we've done enough. Do you want to talk a little bit more about anything else, or do you want to ask him anything, Lisette, before we wrap it all up?
Sorry, the dog's barking. Um, so I don't know if you've ever seen I saw it's the 1776 musical.
Of course, I've seen multiple times.
I
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I saw it at the Guthrie probably like 15 years ago, but one thing that always sticks in my head is that song about how John Adams is so unlikable.
Yeah.
But in the show, I don't know why, but it's always kind of that one song.
Sit
Don't
down,
remember a ton more about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, sit down, John. I always kind of think about that. I mean, and really, what you do in the show is he's more you really kind of develop this warmth about him with Paul Giamatti playing him, but he's very quite likable. Was that something that you kind of worked in, or was that something that you kind of found through it? I know
Adams,
it
Adams
makes
called himself Adams called himself dislikable in the series when he asked Jefferson to write the Declaration, and Jefferson says, "Well, I think you should do it. You're the one who's been blowharding about it every day in Congress. Why not you?" And Adams said, "Because because I'm not widely liked." Anyway, he wasn't wrong. He made himself out. The word he used was, "I've made myself obnoxious." So, but over the course of this is why you can do this in a 7-part limited series and not in a 2-hour movie. You have the time to breathe with Adams and understand the full complexity of his personality and know where some of that difficulty is coming from. I mean, Adams was always difficult. He was a difficult human being. He was a difficult politician. He was a difficult character to write. But I developed a lot of affection for him, partly because David had before me. Remember, David's book was originally going to be a dual biography of Jefferson and Adams during the independence period, because he didn't think Adams, based on what was written about Adams before, could hold his half of the book. And then lo and behold, David discovers all of these letters, all of this diary material, and goes, well, bye Thomas Jefferson. This guy is tabula rasa. And that was what was beautiful about him. You could make a show about the revolution, but you couldn't make one about the revolution with a character who was so unformed in people's minds. People simply didn't know who he was. When I'm working on the project in Santa Fe, writing it, shooting it, I'd say to people, in situations like this, what are you working on? A show about John Adams. And there'd be this beat, and they'd hesitate and go, well, I like his work, but has he really written enough music for a miniseries? Like, oh, no, not that John Adams. Of course you know that John Adams, Dr. Atomic. John Adams, President of the United States, and you just get this deer in headlights expression. Thought that's how I knew we were onto something, because you can do Jefferson, you can do Washington, but people have ideas in their heads about who that person is. And if you go 1 millimeter off from their perception, they're done. But Adams, nobody knew who he was. He was the perfect everyman to tell that story. And Paul was the perfect everyman to play it. It was a wonderful melding of actor and role.
Oh yeah, I mean that was just phenomenal casting.
Yeah.
Really.
And Paul loved playing him.
Really.
He won't admit that. He loved playing him. Yeah.
Wigs and all.
That's right.
God, that was so much fun. This was another episode of Film Talk Weekly, and we spoke about adaptation and adapting from the page to the screen with award-winning writer Kirk Ellis. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.